J.D. Vance was told to leave the restaurant, and everyone expected him to get angry. But his response brought the entire diner into a deep silence. J.D. Vance parked his car at Lily's Diner, a modest eatery in the center of Birchwood, Maine. It was the kind of place that had been around for decades. Neon lights flickered softly, and the smell of burgers cooking on the grill and freshly brewed coffee wafted in as people walked in and out the door. That day, a local resident had recommended it to him, raving about the homemade patties and hand-cut fries. J.D. was pretty tired. A long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy debates had taken its toll, and all he wanted was a peaceful meal before heading back. The bell above the door rang as J.D. walked in. It was a small but cozy place. At least it felt that way at first. The same few patient customers took seats at the same tables every evening, while old Polaroid photos hung near the cash register, displaying memories of customers who had worked there over the years, coming and going. The smell of fried bacon, grease, and freshly brewed coffee mingled in the air, and the pace of conversation in the room slowly rose and fell. J.D. locked eyes with the hostess behind the counter. She was smiling slightly until he recognized her. The moment was almost imperceptibly fleeting, but J.D. recognized it immediately. There was a momentary hesitation on her face, a sudden uncertainty about what to do. Her lips pressed hard together for a brief moment. J.D. glanced around. Some customers had turned their heads in his direction. One man, after cutting his hamburger in half, leaned toward the person across from him and whispered something. Another customer, a woman in a lumberjack shirt, set her coffee cup down on the table a little stiffly. Her eyes narrowed for a brief moment, but then she quickly averted her gaze. J.D. was experienced enough to sense that he was not welcome here. But here, in a restaurant? The hostess hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and smoothed a lock of hair that had fallen behind her ear. "Good evening," she said, her voice careful and measured. "Will you be dining here or picking up a package?" J.D. smiled, slightly tired. "I'll eat here. Is that okay?" Another pause. It was a long wait for such a simple question. The hostess glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at J.D. "I need to check something. Please hold on a second." The woman slipped through the swinging door and went inside. J.D. remained there, waiting. A few more people turned their heads in his direction. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Another mumbled something in a low voice. Something was not right. For a few seconds, there were buzzing sounds from behind the kitchen door. The voices rose and fell, but it was hard to make out what was being said. J.D. took a deep breath and let his shoulders slump back. He wasn't going to create drama here. He wasn't going to assume anything right away. Maybe they had a policy. Maybe they were understaffed. The hostess returned. This time she didn't look indecisive. She seemed to have already made up her mind. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice more stern now. "We cannot serve you this evening." But the way she said it made J.D. feel that all the gazes in the room were centered around that sentence. It was clear that this wasn't just about business. This was a personal matter. J.D. Vance was silent for a while. The words hung in the air, like a weighty statement that needed no explanation. The restaurant had fallen almost completely silent. Not complete silence, but the faint crunch of the grill could still be heard in the kitchen. From somewhere, there was the sound of a fork scraping against a plate. But the usual hum of all other conversations had disappeared. Everyone was watching him. Everyone was waiting. J.D. looked carefully at the hostess's face. She was not hostile, just determined, as if she had made a decision, or maybe someone else had made a decision for her. J.D. Vance's eyes shifted to the kitchen window behind the hostess. Just beyond the counter, in the area where the plates were stacked under the warm lamps, 2 cooks were in place. Their expressions were not clearly discernible. J.D. cleared his throat and regained his voice. "Excuse me, did I make a mistake?" The hostess made no move this time. "It's just, we'd prefer not to serve you this evening." There were no rules, no "we're closing soon" excuse. Just that. J.D. put his hands on his hips and took a deep breath. He was used to political debates and sneaky interviews, but being rejected from a simple roadside diner was a different experience. A cough broke the silence. Turning his head slightly, JD caught the eyes of an elderly man sitting near the counter. He looked like someone who had been eating here for years. His blue work jacket was worn, and his hands bore the marks of a lifetime of labor. Shaking his head slightly, as if muttering something to himself, he took the last bite of his egg and pushed it away with his fork. A few tables away, a woman stirred, her expression uncertain. Across from her, a man, probably in his 30s, crossed his arms and leaned back, as if he was enjoying what was happening. JD noticed and took mental notes. Those who averted their eyes, those who looked too long, those who hid something in their gaze, those who seemed to feel a sharp sense of satisfaction. He had no trouble feeling the weight of the moment. He had a few options. He could get up and leave immediately, shake his head, and ignore everything. Or he could ask for an explanation, question them. He could ask if they realized how this would look on the morning news. He could openly challenge them to see if they would reverse their decision, but he did none of that. He just said, "Okay," nodding slowly, his voice calm and even. "Can I speak to the manager?" This surprised a few people. The waitress hesitated again. Looking toward the kitchen, she waited silently for confirmation. The old man at the counter murmured softly. Someone at the window gave a short laugh. It was as if they doubted he would actually do it. JD just stood there and waited. The waitress disappeared again, this time through another door. A few more seconds of silence, a sip of coffee, a plate slid across. Then the door opened, and in walked a man in his early 50s, with broad shoulders and thick arms, wearing an apron covered in grease stains. His name was Victor on the label. Without asking JD what he wanted, Victor merely glanced at him once and said, "You have a question, I hear." But this didn't sound like a warm welcome. It sounded more like a challenge. JD met Victor's gaze patiently, in a way he couldn't quite decipher. He hadn't come here to argue or make a show of force, but at the same time he had no intention of just walking out without understanding why. "Yes," JD said. "I want to know why you're not serving me." Victor inhaled sharply through his nose, as if he had been expecting this question, but still didn't want to answer. As he wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes remained on the customers in front of him, some watching the conversation intently, others pretending to listen carefully. "Look, Victor," JD said, shifting his weight. "This isn't personal." "It seems pretty personal," JD said, raising his eyebrows. Victor's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally let out a sigh. "People here have their own opinions about you, about the way you stand, about what you do. I have a job, and I don't want any trouble." JD nodded slowly, letting the meaning of the words sink in. "So, when I sit down to eat, there's trouble." Victor didn't answer immediately. Looking at the counter, he noticed that the old man in the work jacket was now chewing his eggs more slowly. A few tables away, the young man was still crossing his arms, watching with amusement, like a spectator. JD Vance had seen this before. It was similar, if not exactly the same. It wasn't just about a single decision. It was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was like a ripple effect. Pressures from all sides, silent expectations. It was what pushed a person to make choices they weren't sure about. He looked at Victor again. "Be honest with me. Do you accept this? Or is the goal just to keep the peace?" Victor hesitated, his fingers curling slightly into his apron. And for the first time, JD noticed that he looked uncomfortable. Maybe Victor wasn't so sure. But before he could answer, the young man let out a loud laugh from the table. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "It's not that deep. You're not welcome here. Simple as that." JD turned to him and stared for a moment. He was probably the type who was looking for a fight, someone waiting for a chance to say something. JD didn't buy it. He just looked at Victor and said, "If you really want me to, I'll go." The words hung in the air. Victor was given a chance to take a breath, to step back, to steer this situation in a different direction. Victor's gaze shifted to the kitchen, then back to JD. "Well," he said, "I don't want things to get ugly." "Me neither," JD said, nodding slowly. For a long moment, none of them spoke. JD could have walked out, nodded, and left without looking back. He could have made a phone call, and made it news. He could have let the internet do what it does best, but he did something unexpected. He pulled up a chair and sat down and said, "Let's talk then." The atmosphere in the room became tense. JD didn't slam his chair down hard, didn't puff out his chest and raise his voice. He just sat there, hands on the table, as if he'd been there for hours. The restaurant wasn't used to this. Most of the time, arguments end quickly. Either someone storms out, or it ends quietly. But tonight was different. Victor looked at him for a long time, then took a deep breath and said, "Talk," as if the word was foreign here. JD shrugged his shoulders and said, "I know you don't want me here, but what I don't understand is why. So let's talk about it." A light laugh escaped from the young man at the table. "I have courage," he said, but JD ignored him. Victor pulled the chair across from JD, but didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned back and watched his hands, still covered by his apron. He was probably hungover from his morning shift. "I run a business," he finally said. "I don't want fights. I don't want headlines, but I have a community, and I have to think about that." JD responded with a nod. "Well then tell me, what does this community think of me?" Victor remained silent, looking over his shoulder, as if it would be better if someone else answered that question. The waiter at the counter shifted uncomfortably. The old man in the work jacket lowered his eyes, but he hadn't eaten with a fork in a long time. Then Victor turned his eyes back to JD. "People here don't like politicians. They don't trust them, and what you say, where you stand, doesn't appeal to them." "That's fair," JD said, leaning back slightly. "But you don't know me, do you?" Victor paused for a moment. "Personally, no." "Then tell me," JD said, "if I were just a regular guy here, not someone you see on TV, would we be having this conversation?" There was a moment of silence. JD let the silence linger, watching the slight change in Victor's face. It wasn't a big change, but it was as if something had broken. Something small, but noticeable. Then, from the back of the room, the young man laughed sarcastically and said, "It's not about TV, man. It's about knowing who you really are." JD turned to him. "And who am I?" The man was grinning, finally getting the attention he wanted. "You're the man who claims to understand ordinary people, but you're politicking as usual." JD thought about this, nodding slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then tell me, what should I have done differently?" The man squinted in surprise. This was not the response he had expected. "If you don't want me," JD said, "okay, but you have the floor. Say what you want to say." The restaurant was now completely silent, not even a sound from the kitchen, no orders being placed. Victor sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't expecting this tonight," he said. JD gave a small, tired smile. "Neither am I," he said. But for the first time, the tension wasn't just separation. It was something else. Something closer to understanding. The diner was no longer just silent. People were watching. Even those who claimed they didn't care were secretly looking over their plates. JD sat patiently. The young man, still leaning back in his chair, looked like he wanted to say something, but this time there was hesitation on his face. Maybe he realized that JD wasn't arguing, not defending himself. He was just waiting. Still holding the chair in front of him, Victor finally took a deep breath. "If you want to know what they think," he nodded his head, "all they say is that everything you are is empty." JD didn't react. He tilted his head slightly, as if thinking about the words. "They tell you they're talking about working-class people, but you're still playing the game, making promises like everyone else. But in the end, nothing changes." Victor took a deep breath through his nose. "And they don't forget," he said. JD nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. The young man smiled wryly. "Is that all you're going to say?" JD turned to him. "What else did you expect me to say?" The man straightened up in his chair. "I don't know, man. You need to argue. You need to defend yourself. Say something." JD put his forearms on the table. "You already made a decision about me before you walked through that door. You wanted to make me angry. You wanted me to react, so you could feel justified. The man's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. JD continued calmly, but if I tell you something, I know exactly how frustration feels. He turned back to Victor. You said nothing has changed. I know that feeling too. I grew up with it. People around me were left behind. Hell, I even felt like I was left behind. Yes, I went to school. I did things people didn't expect me to do, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten. Victor's fingers drummed on the chair. His expression was uncertain, but not condescending, more thoughtful. JD, looking around the diner, you don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your mind, but I'm here as a customer, not as a politician, just as a man looking for food. There was a pause. Then, from the side of the counter, an old man in a work jacket muttered, "Pity a man can't even buy a burger." The tension broke a little. A few people smiled. Even Victor gave a small laugh, shaking his head. JD turned to him again. So what now? Victor sighed, rubbed his face, looking around the kitchen. The chefs were still watching. Then he turned back to JD. I'll tell you what, you sit here and finish this conversation. And if, at the end, I'm not just thinking like everyone else, like someone playing a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll ask my waiter to bring a menu. JD nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. That sounds like a deal, he said. That night, for the first time, the air in the room didn't feel divided. It was something else. Something closer to a conversation. The atmosphere in the diner had changed. The stiffness in Victor's shoulders had lessened. The young man was no longer grinning in his chair. Instead of leaning back, he was sitting, as if this was not a show. Even the silent customers, just watching, seemed less certain in their own judgment. JD leaning slightly forward. Okay, he said, his voice calm. Let's finish this conversation. Victor sighed and sat down in the chair opposite, looking tired. This wasn't the kind of fatigue that comes from a long shift, but it was the kind of fatigue that settles deeply in a person. The weight of years of expectations, the weight of feeling like the world is not listening to you. I'll be honest, Victor said, rubbing his hands together. I don't know if you are what people think you are. I don't know if you really see people like us, or if you just know how to talk well. I don't know that either. JD nodded slowly. Okay, he said, but you don't know me, do you? Victor hesitated. Personally, no. Then tell me, JD said, if I was just a man here, someone you don't see on TV, would we be having this conversation? Silence. JD let the silence stretch. He observed that Victor's expression shifted slightly. It wasn't a complete change, but something broke, even if it was small. But at that moment, from the back of the room, the old man smiled wryly. This isn't a TV issue, man. People know who you really are. JD turned to him. And who am I? The young man smiled because he finally got his attention. You're a man who thinks he understands the people. You play politics like everyone else. JD thought, nodding slowly. Okay, he said. Then tell me, what should I have done differently? The young man blinked. This wasn't the answer he expected. You want me to leave, JD continued. Okay, but you have the floor. Say what you want to say. The diner was completely silent. Even from the kitchen, there was no sound of plates. No orders were being placed. Victor rubbed the back of his neck. Tonight's not what I expected, he said. JD replied with a small, tired smile. Neither am I. But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division. It was something else, something closer to understanding. The diner was no longer just quiet. People were watching. Even those who pretended not to care were peeking over their plates. JD sat patiently. The young man was still leaning back in his seat. He looked like he wanted to say something, but for the first time, hesitation appeared on his face. Maybe JD wasn't arguing. He realized JD wasn't defending himself. He was just waiting. Victor, still gripping the chair in front of him, finally let out a deep breath. If you want to hear me, it's not nice for you here. You know that. But the people here, they have all kinds of opinions about you, about what you say and what you believe. That's why I'm thinking about you. It's really about you. He glanced at JD. Slowly, A smile spread across his face. The young man sitting in his chair said nothing, but now there was a change in his expression. He wasn't fully convinced, but he was no longer completely rejecting JD. While JD finished his dinner, the diner started to feel like a diner again. Conversations began again. Plates began to clatter. Coffee was being poured once more. People still had their opinions. There were still doubts. But for one night, in a small town, it was a different kind of conversation. And maybe that was enough. Because at a time when everyone is ready to shout, sometimes the real power is in staying, listening, and just for a moment, proving that not everything has to be a fight. If you've come this far, I have a question for you. In any case, did you ever have to choose between going or staying and listening? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious what you think. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.